The sun was setting over Pine Ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as Agent Thomas Reid drove through the quiet streets of the suburban neighborhood. To anyone watching, he was just another black man in a modest sit-in, perhaps heading home after a long day of work. There was much more to Thomas than met the eye. For the past 8 months, Thomas had been living a carefully constructed double life in this small Midwestern town. His small 2-bedroom house with faded blue paint and a slightly overgrown lawn was nothing like his real apartment in Virginia. The worn furniture and outdated kitchen were a far cry from his actual taste, but everything about his current life was meticulously designed to maintain his cover. Thomas wasn't just any government employee, he was one of the CIA's top field operatives, with 15 years of exemplary service under his belt. His current assignment was perhaps his most challenging yet, infiltrating the Pure Nation Group, a growing white supremacist organization suspected of forging dangerous connections with international terrorist cells. Another day, another dollar, Thomas muttered to himself as he pulled into his driveway, keeping up appearances even when alone. The neighbors thought he worked night shifts at a factory 2 towns over. In reality, he had just finished a tense meeting with his handler, Agent Chen, exchanging critical intelligence about an upcoming Pure Nation gathering that might finally give them the evidence they needed. Inside his house, Thomas carefully locked the door and went through his routine security check, a habit formed from years in the field. He checked the nearly invisible marks on his windowsills and the positioning of certain objects he left as indicators. Everything was untouched. Good. Thomas loosened his tie and opened his refrigerator, grabbing a bottle of water. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from headquarters. Intel confirmed. Proceed with caution. The weight of his mission pressed on his shoulders as he sat at his kitchen table. Pure Nation wasn't just talking about hate. They were planning something big. Their leader, a former military man who went by the Commander, had been meeting with foreign nationals tied to known terrorist organizations. Thomas had managed to work his way into the group's outer circle, playing the role of a disillusioned veteran with financial troubles and a chip on his shoulder. Thomas opened his laptop and began typing his daily report, carefully documenting every conversation, every observation from today's meeting in code. The agency had given him this assignment because of his unique skills, fluency in 4 languages, extensive combat training, and an unmatched ability to blend into any environment. But there was another reason. Thomas had grown up not far from here and understood the cultural dynamics of the region better than most agents. He glanced at the single-framed photo he allowed himself, his parents at their 40th anniversary, their smiles wide and genuine. They thought he worked as a security consultant for international businesses. The lies weighed on him sometimes, but he knew his work was vital. Groups like Pure Nation had been growing bolder, their rhetoric more violent, their plans more dangerous. As Thomas finished his report and encrypted it for transmission, he heard a car slow down outside. Through a small gap in his curtains, he spotted a police cruiser passing by, the 3rd time this week. Officer Reynolds behind the wheel, his partner Officer Clark beside him. Thomas had noticed them watching him around town, their suspicion barely concealed. Just what I need, Thomas thought, his face revealing nothing as the cruiser eventually moved on. In his line of work, attention from local law enforcement was an unwelcome complication. He'd have to be extra careful now. Any slip could blow his cover and destroy months of careful work. More importantly, it could put him in real danger. Little did Thomas know that these 2 officers would soon become the biggest threat to his mission and his life. As he prepared for bed, setting his alarm for another early morning meeting with Pure Nation members, Officers Reynolds and Clark were having a conversation in their patrol car about the suspicious newcomer in the Blue House and how they might need to check him out more thoroughly. The pieces were falling into place for a confrontation that would shake the entire town to its core. 3 days later, Thomas was driving home from a late-night meeting with his handler. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty roads as his headlights cut through the darkness. His mind was racing with the new information he'd just received. Pure Nation was planning something for next month, something big that involved weapons smuggled through Canada. The red and blue lights flashing in his rearview mirror pulled him from his thoughts. Thomas checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. A quick mental inventory confirmed he had nothing suspicious in the car. Taking a deep breath, he pulled over to the shoulder, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, just as he taught younger agents to do in similar situations. Stay calm. Follow procedure. Nothing to worry about, he reminded himself, watching in his side mirror as two officers approached, Reynolds and Clark, the same ones who'd been driving by his house. Officer Reynolds approached the driver's side while Officer Clark hung back, hand resting on his holster. Thomas rolled down his window, maintaining a neutral expression. License and registration, Reynolds demanded without explanation, his flashlight being shining directly into Thomas's eyes. May I ask why I've been pulled over, officer? Thomas asked respectfully, squinting against the harsh light. Broken taillight, Reynolds replied curtly, though Thomas knew for a fact his car was in perfect condition. License and registration, now. Thomas moved slowly, narrating his actions. I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket, and my registration is in the glove compartment. As he handed over his documents, he noticed Reynolds studying his fake ID with unusual intensity. Step out of the vehicle, please, Reynolds ordered suddenly. Have I done something wrong, officer? Thomas asked, still keeping his voice level. I said step out of the vehicle, Reynolds repeated, his hand moving to rest on his weapon. Thomas complied, opening the door slowly and stepping out onto the asphalt. The night air was cool against his skin. Were you coming from this late? Clark asked, moving closer, circling like a predator. Just finished a late shift, heading home, Thomas replied with the cover story he'd established months ago. You work at the factory, right? Funny thing is, I got a buddy who works there too. Says he's never seen you, Reynolds said, moving uncomfortably close to Thomas's face. Before Thomas could respond, Reynolds sniffed dramatically. You been drinking tonight? No, sir. I don't drink. Thomas answered truthfully. I think I smell something else, Clark chimed in, exchanging a look with his partner. Smells like marijuana to me. You got any drugs in the car? Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He recognized what was happening. He'd researched these officers' history of complaints from black motorists. No, officer. There are no drugs in my vehicle or on my person. I do not consent to a search, Thomas stated firmly, invoking his constitutional rights. Reynolds' face hardened. Well, that's not how this works around here. If I say I smell something, that gives me probable cause. I understand the law, officer. I respectfully maintain that I do not consent to a search, Thomas repeated, knowing that staying calm was his best defense right now. He couldn't risk blowing his cover by calling his CIA contacts, not yet. Got ourselves a lawyer here, Clark, Reynolds sneered. Hands against the vehicle. Spread your legs. Thomas complied with a pat-down, knowing resistance would only escalate the situation. Reynolds was rough, pushing him harder than necessary against the car. What's this? Clark said suddenly, emerging from the passenger side of Thomas's car where he'd gone without permission. He held up a small bag of white powder. Thomas's blood ran cold. That's not mine. That was not in my car. Looks like cocaine to me, Reynolds said with a smirk. You're under arrest. As Reynolds roughly handcuffed him, Thomas caught a glimpse of Clark's satisfied expression. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that they had planted the evidence. You have the right to remain silent, Reynolds recited, tightening the cuffs until they bit into Thomas's wrists. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Thomas said nothing as they pushed him into the back of their patrol car. His mind was already working through scenarios and protocols. He had been trained for high-stakes situations behind enemy lines, for torture resistance, for deep cover operations. But somehow, being framed by corrupt cops in his own country hit differently. As the patrol car pulled away, leaving his vehicle by the roadside, Thomas caught sight of a security camera on a nearby building. A faint hope flickered. If that camera was working, it might have captured the entire encounter. It might have recorded Clark planting evidence in his car. For now, though, Thomas had to play the role of a wrongfully accused citizen. The CIA had protocols for compromised agents, but he needed to make a specific phone call first. As the officers laughed in the front seat, Thomas closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. This wasn't just about his mission anymore. This was about justice. The booking process at Pine Ridge Police Station was humiliating but familiar to Thomas. He'd studied it as part of his training, though experiencing it firsthand was different. The fingerprinting, the mugshots, the cold stares from desk officers who'd already decided he was guilty based solely on Reynolds and Clark's report, and Thomas suspected, the color of his skin. One phone call, the booking officer said gruffly, pointing to a wall-mounted phone. Thomas nodded, his mind clear despite the situation. This call wouldn't be to a lawyer or a family member. He dialed a number from memory, one that wouldn't appear in any phone records as belonging to the CIA, but rather as a bail bonds service. "Sunrise Bail Bonds," answered a woman's voice. "This is Blackbird. Authentication code Delta 9 Echo 72. Thomas spoke quietly, his back to the officer who was pretending not to listen. A brief pause. Acknowledged Blackbird. Nature of compromise. Local interference. Level 2 situation. Requesting Protocol Amber. Understood. Time frame. Thomas glanced at the clock on the wall. 24 to 48 hours acceptable. Surveillance retrieval priority. Confirmed. Stay in role. The call ended. To anyone listening, it would have sounded like a routine call about bail. In reality, Thomas had just activated an emergency protocol. Within minutes, his handler Agent Chen would be notified. Within an hour, a team would be securing the security camera footage from the traffic stop. Within a day, background checks more thorough than anything the local police could imagine would be running on officers Reynolds and Clark. Protocol Amber meant the CIA wouldn't immediately extract him. They would let the legal process begin while gathering evidence, keeping his cover intact for as long as possible. It was a delicate balance, protecting an agent while not exposing ongoing operations. As Thomas was led to a holding cell, he caught sight of someone unexpected, Officer Lopez, a younger cop he'd seen around town but never interacted with. Unlike the others, she was watching the situation with concern rather than contempt. "Hey Reynolds, Clark," she called out as they finished their paperwork. "Can I talk to you guys about the arrest report?" Thomas couldn't hear their conversation, but he could read body language. Officer Lopez was uncomfortable with something. Reynolds was dismissive, Clark defensive. Interest piqued. Thomas filed this observation away as potentially useful. Hours passed in the cold cell. Eventually, Thomas was brought to an interrogation room where Reynolds and Clark were waiting, along with a stern-faced man in an expensive suit. "I'm District Attorney Wilson," the man announced. "These officers caught you with 50 grams of cocaine. That's a felony. You're looking at 5 to 10 years minimum." He leaned forward. "Unless you want to tell us who your supplier is." "Those drugs aren't mine," Thomas stated calmly. "They were planted in my vehicle by your officers." Reynolds slammed his hand on the table. "You calling us liars?" "I'm stating facts," Thomas replied, unruffled. "I know my rights. I want a lawyer." "Suit yourself," Wilson shrugged, gathering his files. "Enjoy county lockup until your arraignment." After they left, Thomas was allowed to meet briefly with a public defender, a tired-looking woman named Wu with too many cases and too little time. "They're pushing for no bail," she explained, flipping through his file. "First-time offender, but DA's claiming you're a flight risk because you've only lived here 8 months." "The drugs weren't mine," Thomas told her. "The officers planted them." Wu's eyes softened with sympathy and something else, resignation. "Mr. Reed, I've heard that before. Without evidence, it's your word against 2 officers." "Check for security cameras near Pine and Oakwood where I was pulled over," Thomas suggested. "I'll try, but don't get your hopes up," Wu sighed. "Look, I'll do my best at the arraignment tomorrow, but with the current judge," she trailed off. After Wu left, Thomas was transferred to a holding cell with 3 other men. He kept to himself, analyzing his situation. The CIA would be working behind the scenes, but they wouldn't compromise national security for one agent unless absolutely necessary. He needed to play this smart. Meanwhile, Officer Lopez sat alone in her patrol car, staring at her notebook. She'd written down what she'd witnessed back at the station, Reynolds and Clark high-fiving before booking Thomas, Clark saying, "That's one more of them off the streets." She'd seen Reynolds pull a small baggie from his pocket earlier that day, identical to the one they claimed to find in Thomas's car. Her hand trembled as she considered her options. Speaking up meant risking her career, maybe worse. Staying silent meant being complicit in what she increasingly suspected was a frame-up. Several miles away, in a nondescript hotel room, Agent Chen was setting up a mobile command center. On multiple screens, she reviewed Thomas's file, the officer's records, and grainy security footage just obtained from a gas station camera across from where Thomas had been pulled over. "Got you," she murmured, freezing a frame that clearly showed Officer Clark planting something in Thomas's car while Reynolds kept him occupied. She picked up a secure phone. "Director, we have confirmation of planted evidence. How do you want to proceed with Blackbird?" The answer would determine not just Thomas's fate, but potentially expose a network of corruption that might reach further than anyone suspected. Director Patel sat at her desk, eyes fixed on the security footage playing on her laptop. The grainy video clearly showed Officer Clark planting evidence in Thomas's car. She paused the video and looked at Agent Chen on the secure video call. "How's our Pure Nation investigation?" she asked. Thomas made significant progress. He was days away from attending a meeting with their leadership and international contacts, Chen replied. Patel tapped her fingers on the desk, weighing options. 2 parts here. Extract him now, kill the charges quietly, or let this play out and expose the corruption in that department. If we pull him now, we lose months of work on Pure Nation, Chen pointed out. But if we let him go through the system, we risk exposing an undercover operative, Patel countered. After a moment's thought, Patel made her decision. We proceed with caution, no immediate extraction. Build a case, but keep Thomas's identity protected as long as possible. Maybe we can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, clean up this police department while continuing our investigation. Chen nodded. I'll coordinate with our legal team. And Chen, Patel added, get someone close to that Officer Lopez. She might be useful. The next morning, Thomas stood before Judge Fletcher in a crowded courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. His public defender, Ms. Wu, looked exhausted but determined. Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty, Wu stated. We request reasonable bail. Mr. Reid has no prior record, has steady employment, and poses no flight risk. District Attorney Wilson stepped forward. Your Honor, the defendant was caught with a significant amount of cocaine. We request remand without bail pending trial. Judge Fletcher, a stern woman in her 60s, reviewed the paperwork. Bail is set at $150,000. That amount might as well have been $1 million for most defendants. Thomas knew the CIA could easily post it, but wondered if they would. Too much intervention too quickly might raise suspicions. As Thomas was led away, he noticed a young woman in the gallery making eye contact with Ms. Wu. The woman nodded subtly, and Wu's posture changed, straightening with new confidence. Back in the holding area, Wu visited Thomas with surprising news. Someone posted your bail, she said quietly. And I've been contacted by a civil rights attorney who wants to join your defense team. She says she has evidence that Officers Reynolds and Clark have a history of planting evidence on black suspects. Thomas maintained his cover. I don't understand. Who would post my bail? I don't know anyone with that kind of money. The Innocent Justice Project, Wu replied. They take on cases like yours where there's evidence of police misconduct. Thomas recognized the cover. The Innocent Justice Project was almost certainly a CIA front. They were moving pieces on the board. There's more, Wu continued, lowering her voice. A police officer has come forward, willing to testify that she witnessed suspicious behavior from Reynolds and Clark regarding your arrest. Officer Lopez had made her choice. Meanwhile, District Attorney Wilson sat in his office with Chief Bennett, both men looking worried. This was supposed to be a simple case, Wilson complained. Now I've got civil rights attorneys crawling all over it, and one of your officers ready to testify against her colleagues. Chief Bennett wiped sweat from his forehead. Reynolds and Clark have brought in a lot of drug busts. Good arrests that made both our departments look good. But were they good arrests? Wilson asked. If they've been planting evidence. We can't throw them under the bus, Bennett insisted. If one case falls apart, defense attorneys will challenge every arrest they've ever made. Do you want to see dozens of convictions overturned? What do you suggest? Wilson asked. Pressure Lopez to keep quiet. Offer Reid a plea deal, time served if he pleads to a lesser charge. Make this go away. What neither man knew was that a tiny microphone had been planted in Wilson's office earlier that day during a routine maintenance check, standard CIA procedure when investigating potential corruption. At a small apartment serving as a temporary safe house, Thomas sat with Agent Chen and their legal team, listening to the recorded conversation. They're scared, Chen observed, and they should be. The question is how deep this goes, Thomas said. Is it just these two officers or is this systemic? Does it connect to Pure Nation somehow? Chen pulled up files on her laptop. We've been digging. In the past 3 years, Reynolds and Clark have arrested 47 people on drug charges. 43 were black or Hispanic. Most couldn't afford decent legal representation and took plea deals. And the Pure Nation connection? Thomas asked. Nothing concrete yet, Chen replied. But there's something interesting. Chief Bennett's brother-in-law is a frequent attendee at Pure Nation meetings. Thomas leaned forward. So we keep pushing. Let this go to trial. It's risky, Chen cautioned. Your cover is already compromised locally, Thomas finished. But if we can expose this corruption ring, it'll be worth it. And I might still be able to get close to Pure Nation's leadership through a different angle. Chen studied him for a moment, then nodded. I'll tell the director you recommend proceeding. But Thomas, this gets complicated from here. Once you're out on bail, Reynolds and Clark might see you as a threat. Let them, Thomas said, determination in his eyes. I faced worse than 2 corrupt cops. What he didn't say was how personal this had become. As a black man who'd served his country for 15 years, seeing officers of the law plant evidence and frame innocent people struck at his core. This wasn't just a mission anymore. This was about justice, about right and wrong. And Thomas Reid was ready to see it through, no matter how dangerous the path ahead. The weeks leading up to the trial were tense. Thomas was back in his blue house, but it no longer felt like a safe cover. Twice he spotted Reynolds and Clark driving slowly past, their eyes fixed on him with unmistakable hatred. Thomas documented each incident meticulously, adding to the growing case file. Ms. Wu had transformed from an overworked public defender into a fierce advocate, bolstered by resources from the Innocent Justice Project and the civil rights attorney, Ms. Parker. Thomas knew Parker was actually Agent Diane Lee, one of the CIA's top legal specialists, but maintained the pretense of not knowing her. We filed motions to exclude the evidence based on illegal search and seizure, Wu explained during a strategy meeting in Thomas's living room. We've also requested all disciplinary records for Reynolds and Clark and their arrest statistics broken down by race. Will the judge allow that? Thomas asked, playing his role. Judge Fletcher is tough but fair, Parker replied. The police department is fighting it, but we have grounds, especially with Officer Lopez's testimony. Thomas glanced at the window. How is she doing? It can't be easy, turning against fellow officers. Parker's expression darkened. She's being ostracized at work. Anonymous threats left in her locker. We've offered her protection, but she's stubborn. What Parker didn't mention was that CIA agents were already keeping watch over Lopez, ensuring her safety while maintaining distance. That evening, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Chief Bennett himself knocked on his door, alone and looking uncomfortable. Mr. Reid, he said stiffly when Thomas answered. May I come in? I'd like to talk. Thomas hesitated, then stepped aside. He had a recording device active in his living room, standard procedure now. Bennett declined to sit. I'll get straight to the point. The DA is willing to drop all charges. No play, no admission of guilt. Clean slate. Just like that? Thomas asked, feigning surprise. Just like that, Bennett confirmed. In return, you sign an agreement not to sue the department or officers. Thomas studied the police chief. Why would you offer this if you believe I'm guilty? Bennett shifted his weight. Look, there are concerns about how your case was handled. We want to resolve this quietly. Chief Bennett, Thomas said carefully, your officers planted drugs in my car and falsified reports. I spent 3 days in jail for a crime I didn't commit. Others without my resources might still be there. This isn't about me anymore. Bennett's face hardened. Don't be stupid. Take the deal. Things can get very difficult for people who make enemies of the police in this town. "Are you threatening me?" Thomas asked, voice deadly calm. Bennett moved toward the door. "I'm giving you good advice. Consider it carefully. This offer expires tomorrow." After Bennett left, Thomas immediately called Parker. "The chief just visited. Offered to drop charges if I sign away my right to sue." "We expected this," Parker replied. "It confirms they're worried." "Did he say anything else?" "Made a veiled threat. I got it recorded." "Perfect. And Thomas, we found something. Financial records show payments from a shell company to both Reynolds and Clark. The same company funnels money to Pure Nation." Thomas sat up straighter. "So there is a connection." "Looks that way. Chief Bennett's brother-in-law isn't just attending meetings, he's their treasurer." The pieces were falling into place. The next morning, Wu received a formal plea offer from the DA's office. As she reviewed it with Thomas and Parker, Officer Lopes arrived, looking nervous. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I thought you should know. Reynolds and Clark are telling everyone they have a surprise witness for the trial. Someone who will testify they bought drugs from you." Thomas exchanged glances with Parker. "They're manufacturing witnesses now." "It gets worse," Lopez continued. "I overheard Reynolds on the phone. He said something about taking care of the problem if the case looks bad for them." "I think he was talking about you, Mr. Reed." The threat assessment had just escalated. Thomas knew the CIA would need to adjust their approach. That afternoon, Thomas met with Director Patel at a secure location that reviewed all the evidence gathered, the falsified reports, the video of drugs being planted, the financial connections to Pure Nation, the threats. "This is bigger than we thought," Patel said. "Pure Nation has been using corrupt cops to target minorities, building their arrest records while funding white supremacist activities with drug money. It's possible some of these officers are full members." "We need to see this through," Thomas insisted. "If we bail now, they'll target someone else. And our investigation into Pure Nation's international connections stalls." Patel nodded slowly. "Agreed. But your safety is compromised. Reynolds and Clark are desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." "I can handle them," Thomas said confidently. "Not alone," Patel replied. "From now on, you have round-the-clock protection. Covert, but present, and we're accelerating the timeline. Trial starts next week." "What about my cover?" Patel's expression was resolute. "We may need to burn it. If that happens, we do it in a controlled way that maximizes impact. Are you prepared for that possibility?" Thomas thought about the 15 years he'd given to the agency, the countless operations, the lives saved by his work. He thought about the innocent people framed by Reynolds and Clark sitting in prison cells right now. "Whatever it takes," he said firmly. "Let's bring them down." As he left the meeting, Thomas felt a mix of tension and determination. The trial would be the battleground, but the war was much bigger. Little did Reynolds and Clark know that their routine frame-up had inadvertently triggered an operation that would expose not just their corruption, but an entire network of hate and criminality. The countdown to trial day had begun. The Pine Ridge County Courthouse was packed to capacity on the first day of trial. Reporters from local papers squeezed into the back rows, drawn by rumors of police corruption and racial profiling. Thomas sat at the defense table in a crisp navy suit, the picture of calm dignity. Beside him, Ms. Wu and Ms. Parker arranged their files with quiet confidence. Across the aisle, District Attorney Wilson looked less self-assured than usual, his normal swagger replaced by tight shoulders and a furrowed brow. Reynolds and Clark sat directly behind him, both men glaring at Thomas with undisguised hatred. Judge Fletcher entered, her stern presence commanding immediate silence. "Commonwealth versus Thomas Reed," she announced. "Are both sides ready to proceed?" The trial began with opening statements. Wilson went first, his voice lacking its usual resonance. "The evidence will show that the defendant was in possession of cocaine with intent to distribute. Officers Reynolds and Clark were simply doing their duty to keep drugs off our streets." When Parker rose for the defense, her measured tone carried throughout the courtroom. "This case isn't about drugs. It's about abuse of power. We will prove that officers Reynolds and Clark deliberately planted evidence and falsified reports to frame an innocent man, not their first time doing so. This trial will expose a pattern of racial targeting and corruption that goes beyond these two officers." Wilson objected immediately. Your Honor, defense counsel is making unfounded accusations against the police department. These accusations are the foundation of our defense, Your Honor, and we have evidence to support them, Parker replied smoothly. Judge Fletcher considered for a moment. Objection overruled. But Ms. Parker, you'll need to substantiate these claims. We will, Your Honor. The prosecution called Reynolds as their first witness. He recounted a story that Thomas knew was rehearsed, how they'd pulled him over for a broken taillight, noticed suspicious behavior, smelled marijuana, and discovered cocaine during a legal search. During cross-examination, Parker approached with quiet confidence. Officer Reynolds, where exactly did you find the drugs in Mr. Reed's car? Passenger side glove compartment, ma'am, Reynolds answered promptly. Parker nodded, then displayed a photograph. And is this the bag of cocaine you found? Yes, ma'am. Your Honor, I'd like to enter Defense Exhibit O, Parker said, playing a video on the courtroom screen. The security camera footage from the gas station clearly showed Clark approaching the passenger side of Thomas's car while Reynolds kept him occupied at the driver's side. Officer Reynolds, this footage shows your partner at the passenger side door of my client's vehicle during the traffic stop before you claim to have found cause for search. Can you explain that? Reynolds's face paled. He was checking for other occupants, standard procedure. With his hand in his pocket, then reaching into the vehicle, Parker asked, is that also standard procedure? Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Fletcher called for order. Parker continued relentlessly, presenting evidence of Reynolds's and Clark's history of targeting black motorists, the statistical improbability of their drug arrest record, and finally calling Officer Lopez to the stand. Lopez testified with quiet dignity about the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed, including specific statements made by Reynolds and Clark about getting another one off the streets when Thomas was arrested. By the lunch recess, the prosecution's case was crumbling. Thomas watched Wilson huddled in intense conversation with Reynolds and Clark in the hallway, their gestures becoming increasingly agitated. When court resumed, Wilson called their surprise witness, a thin, nervous man named Kemp who claimed he had purchased drugs from Thomas on multiple occasions. Thomas had never seen him before, and a quick note passed to Parker confirmed that CIA background checks had found connections between Kemp and Reynolds' brother. Parker's cross-examination was devastating. Mr. Kemp, are you currently facing charges for possession with intent to distribute? Yes, Kemp admitted reluctantly. And were you offered a deal in exchange for your testimony today? Objection, Wilson called out. Goes to witness credibility, Your Honor, Parker responded. Overruled. The witness will answer. Kemp shifted uncomfortably. They said things would go easier for me. By the time Parker finished, Kemp had admitted he never met Thomas before and had been coached on what to say. As the defense prepared to present their case, Director Patel slipped into the back of the courtroom, nodding slightly to Thomas. The moment of decision had arrived. Parker approached the bench. Your Honor, we call Director Patel of the Central Intelligence Agency. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Judge Fletcher banged her gavel for order, her own expression betraying surprise. Approach the bench, counsel, she ordered. At the sidebar, Parker spoke quietly but firmly. Your Honor, this witness will establish Mr. Reed's true identity and the nature of his work in Pine Ridge. Given the sensitive nature of this testimony, we request a brief closed session. Wilson looked stunned. This is highly irregular, Your Honor. We've had no notice of this witness. Judge Fletcher studied Director Patel, who had presented her credentials. After a long moment, she nodded. Clear the courtroom except for essential personnel and the jury. As the spectators filed out, Reynolds and Clark exchanged confused glances. Thomas sat perfectly still, knowing that his cover was about to be officially burned, but the greater mission was about to succeed. Once the doors were closed, Director Patel took the stand and was sworn in. Director Patel, what is your relationship to the defendant? Parker asked. Thomas Reed is a senior intelligence officer with the Central Intelligence Agency, Patel stated. He has been operating undercover in Pine Ridge as part of a national security investigation into domestic terrorism and international connections to the white supremacist group known as Pure Nation. Reynolds' face went slack with shock. Clark dropped his pen. and District Attorney Wilson looked like he might be sick. The truth was finally coming to light. Director Patel's testimony left the courtroom in stunned silence. Judge Fletcher's normally impassive face showed rare emotion as she processed the implications. The jury members exchanged wide-eyed glances. Reynolds and Clark sat frozen, the color drained from their faces. Agent Reid has been investigating Pure Nation for 8 months, Director Patel continued, her voice steady and authoritative. His work has been critical in uncovering connections between domestic extremists and foreign terrorist cells. The traffic stop and subsequent arrest not only put Agent Reid's personal safety at risk, but also compromised a significant national security operation. District Attorney Wilson finally found his voice. "Your Honor, this is extraordinary. The prosecution had no knowledge of the defendant's status." "That's rather the point of undercover work, Counselor," Judge Fletcher replied dryly. When the public was allowed back into the courtroom, Judge Fletcher made a brief statement. "Based on evidence and testimony presented to this court, I am dismissing all charges against Thomas Reid with prejudice. This case will not be reopened." The spectators erupted in confused murmurs as Thomas stood, buttoning his suit jacket with calm dignity. Reynolds lunged toward him, his face contorted with rage, but federal agents who had quietly entered the courtroom stepped between them. "You're finished, Reynolds," Thomas said quietly. "It's over." The aftermath was swift and far-reaching. Within hours, FBI agents were arresting Reynolds, Clark, and 3 other officers involved in the corruption scheme. Chief Bennett was taken into custody at his home, charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. District Attorney Wilson announced his immediate resignation, hoping in vain to distance himself from the scandal. 1 week later, Thomas sat in a secure conference room at FBI headquarters, watching a news broadcast on a wall-mounted screen. "The fallout continues from what's being called the Pine Ridge Conspiracy," the anchor reported. Federal authorities have announced a complete review of all cases handled by the 6 arrested officers, potentially affecting hundreds of convictions. Already, 17 people have been released from prison after evidence of false arrests and planted evidence came to light. The screen showed images of tearful reunions as wrongfully convicted men and women embraced their families outside the county jail. Thomas felt a deep satisfaction watching these scenes. This was why he had chosen not to walk away when he could have. The door opened and Director Patel entered with Agent Chen. "You've been busy," Thomas observed, gesturing to the news report. "Just getting started," Chen replied. "The financial trail from Pure Nation has led us to similar operations in 3 other states. Corrupt officers, false arrests, forfeited property, all feeding money back to extremist groups." "And the international connection?" Thomas asked. Patel slid a folder across the table. "We confirmed it. Pure Nation was funneling weapons and training to terror cells abroad in exchange for funding. Your work gave us everything we needed, even without the final meeting." Thomas nodded, a mix of pride and regret washing over him. "So what happens now?" "My cover's blown." "Now you get to choose," Patel said. "We can set you up with a new identity, new posting, or you could take a different role. The FBI has asked if you lead a new task force focused on weeding out corrupted law enforcement with ties to extremist groups. Your experience makes you uniquely qualified." Thomas considered this. Working in the open, no more covers. "Your face was all over the news," Chen pointed out. "But that might be an advantage now. You've become a symbol. People would trust you." "What about Officer Lopez?" Thomas asked. "She took an enormous risk." "Already recruited her," Patel smiled. "She starts training next month." Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. For 15 years, he'd lived in shadows, worn masks, been whoever each mission required. The thought of working as himself, using his real experiences to drive real change, it was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I'll take the task force," he decided. 3 months later, Thomas stood at a podium, cameras flashing as he addressed the press. Behind him stood a diverse team of agents, including Lopez, now wearing an FBI badge. "Today we're announcing the first results of the Integrity Task Force investigation," Thomas stated. 37 officers in 12 jurisdictions have been charged with civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. But this is about more than arrests. It's about restoring trust between communities and those sworn to protect them. A reporter raised her hand. Agent Reed, given what happened to you, are you concerned about backlash from police departments? Thomas leaned into the microphone, his voice resolute. The vast majority of officers serve with honor. They want corrupt cops rooted out as much as anyone. This isn't anti-police, it's pro-justice. That evening, Thomas visited the county jail where several of his task force's arrests were being processed. As he walked through security, he passed a familiar face in a prisoner transport line, Reynolds, being returned from a court hearing. Their eyes met briefly. You got lucky, Reynolds spat. If I'd known who you were. If you'd known who I was, Thomas interrupted calmly, you might have thought twice about your actions. But that's the point, isn't it? You never should have done it to anyone, regardless of who they were. As he walked away, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A simple undercover assignment had exposed a conspiracy that spread across multiple states, freed innocent people from prison, and launched a national reckoning on corruption and racism in law enforcement. Sometimes justice came from unexpected places, and sometimes being forced out of the shadows was exactly what was needed to bring darkness to light.